Ladies and gentlemen, Deb Spore.
Well, thank you, Youngmi. I'm just going to stop right here and just savor your words. That was really, really wonderful of you. Thank you. And thank you to all the fabulous women of the WSA for arranging this event and for celebrating this really interesting milestone here at HBS. Thanks to all of you for coming, and a particular shout out to the intrepid men in the room. Glad you're here. So it is, it's really a great pleasure to be back. I left HBS 4 years ago. It still feels like home to be here. It feels bizarre. I actually checked into the Charles Hotel for the first time rather than just having tea at Henrietta's. But it's great. It's great to be back here. This really does still feel like home. So thank you for allowing me to come back. And what I want to talk about today is research for a book that's going to be coming out in probably September of next year. I'm almost certain that the title that you see here will not ultimately be the title. We're in sort of title selection mode right now. But for the moment, I'm calling it Dancing at Utopia Mall, which means nothing, but you'll hopefully see sort of what it alludes to as I go through the talk. And then the subtitle, which does capture what it's about, Dreams of Sex, Choice, and Beauty at the Edge of the Feminist Era. Not totally self-explanatory, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of where I'm going. And I'm only going to sort of dip into pieces of the book, but hopefully it'll give us some things to talk about, and then we can open it up for conversation. And one of the reasons it's so nice to be here to give this talk is that this book started at HBS. It started at HBS in part because I actually began the research for it while I was here. But more importantly, it started at HBS because it grew out of my experiences here. It was not an obvious book to write as a senior faculty member at Harvard Business School. But it really grew out of my experiences, not so much specific to HBS, but just my experience growing up as a professional woman in this, rather idiosyncratic environment that I used to live in, and that you all, most of you still do live in. So I began my career totally oblivious to the fact that I was female. Or more to the point, aware of my gender only insofar as it had really been an asset to me in my career. I grew up right after feminism. By which I mean that by the time I became even vaguely politically and socially conscious, feminism had already happened. So I think many women of my generation, and probably extending down to most of yours, I thought, great, thank you very much, feminism. You've fought all the battles, you've won all the wars, I can go out now and do whatever I want. And I was raised to believe that. All the media around me suggested that that would be true. And if anything, if I'm really honest with myself, I realized that I was getting advantages because I was female. Because I was the woman in the room when they needed a woman. Some of my colleagues may recall that at a certain point in my career, I actually said to people, if you begin any sentence to me by saying, we really need a woman, I will say no. But for many years of my career, it was very, very beneficial to be the woman when they needed a woman. Now, there's what I really need. So the image I use to sort of capture this is an image that if you're of a certain age, you will definitely remember this ad. If you're a little younger, you may have seen it from time to time. This was an ad that ran in the early 1970s, early to mid 1970s. The model there is Shelley Hack, who subsequently went on to become one of the Charlie's Angels. So the word Charlie is a big word in my book, because I refer to this as the Charlie complex, because this is what I thought life was like. I thought that as you grew up, this is just what happened to you. You got this was attractive in the 1970s. You got this really nice pantsuit, you got a great hairdo, you look gorgeous, and you were obviously just off to some fabulous job. There was another image that I can't find, but it is etched in my memory, so either it's somewhere or I've just created it. But it was Shelley Hack as well, in an even nicer outfit, with a better briefcase, and a daughter, or at least a very pretty little blonde girl by her side. So the assumption there was that you're going to work, you're going to leave the kids somewhere, where presumably has good childcare, and you're going to waltz off to the job, and the kid's going to be fine, and life as we know it is just perfect. This is what I thought the world was like. And this is what I think many ambitious, smart women of my generation presumed, that we would just waltz into the professional world and everything would just work out. And to some extent, it was true. And I think that's sort of what defined my career throughout the early years. And then all of a sudden, it kind of hit me. That was different. That life wasn't going to be like the Charlie commercial, and that, in fact, the sheer fact of my gender was going to be an issue. And that realization really came to me when I was a junior faculty member at HBS. And as we were just talking, I was speaking with some of you, before this presentation, I think that's still true here. That it's different being a woman on the faculty than it is being a man, just as it's different being a young woman at most investment banks than it is being a man. And I suddenly became more and more intrigued by this question of what were the differences between being a professional woman and being a professional man. As I sort of survived longer and longer here, I was more often asked to help solve the woman's problem. And would sort of be called into offices saying, Deb, we need you to kind of solve the woman's thing. And I became slowly convinced of two things. First of all, that there was a woman's problem, which I had been actively denying all of my career up until that point. I really became convinced that there was a woman's problem. And secondly, and more importantly, that it wasn't an easy problem to fix. That there were no switches that could be flicked or policies that could be passed that would just solve the women's problem. And a number of us in the room spent many years, and I know many people are still struggling with this now, to solve the women's problem, which is not specific to HBS. It exists just about everywhere. But I think we all were realizing that it was just a more difficult problem to address because, to some extent, the first wave feminists had done what, in retrospect, was the easier part. They had changed the policies, they had changed the rules, they opened up HBS to women, and we were left now with a subtler set of problems that couldn't be addressed by regulation alone. So just as I was sort of struggling through these thoughts and beginning the early stages of what would become this book, I left HBS and I moved to Barnard, an all-women's college. And I underwent what I now refer to as a massive hormonal shift. Because I left this place, which in all due respect has a fair amount of testosterone floating around. And all of a sudden I moved to Barnard, where, as one of my beloved former colleagues would have said, you can't find testosterone with a search party. And you can't. It's a very female place. And one of the things that I realized sort of immediately, and then took more time to think through it, was that organizations run by women, in my opinion, are fundamentally different than organizations run by men. They're not better. They're just different. They feel different. Meetings run differently. People are hired differently. People are fired differently. Arguments get fought in a very different way. And so I really started to spend some time thinking about and eventually researching what was it that made women-run organizations different than male-run organizations, and what might we do by sort of trying to think about these differences in a productive way. And what I eventually have become convinced of is, just to repeat briefly, that the women's problem today is much more subtle than it was in the time of the Charlie complex. We no longer face problems around rules and regulations. I don't think we face problems based in prejudice. I really don't. I think just about every man I've seen, whether it's running this place, running investment banks, running major corporations. They really want to solve the women's problem. They just don't know really what it is, much less how to do it. And I don't blame them. I mean, it's a tough problem, and I think it's not prejudice. I don't think, thankfully, we face a situation anymore where men are trying to stop women from advancing. I think quite the contrary. It's just that we don't know how to fix these issues. I also think, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, I think we need to grapple with the fact that some of the differences between men and women and men-run and women-run organizations exist in this little discussed thing called biology. We have kind of overlooked the basic underlying biological differences between men and women that play out in some very, very important ways that we don't really feel comfortable discussing. And I think we need to bring that back to the table. And then finally, and most critically, I began convinced, mostly from watching my friends, my colleagues, and my students, that women's lives just play out differently. That even if a woman and a man start at the same point, they've just graduated from pick your high prestige college, they've done 2 years at pick your high prestige investment bank, they've come to the same Ivy League business school. After that point, their lives are going to unfold differently. Again, not that one is better or worse, but they will be different. And we need to understand those patterns of difference, or we will be condemning women to try to replicate lives that, in fact, are not going to be very easy for them to sustain. And then finally, as I was hearing stories from my friends, and particularly from Barnard alums, from HBS alums, and I started to go back and reread or read all of the feminist theory that I had actively not read for the entire period of my education, I began to become convinced of how deeply some of women's problems stem from our own expectations. Expectations, more specifically, that have been generated by feminism, embraced by our mothers and grandmothers, generationally speaking, blasted continuously at us by the media, and carved into our psyches nearly from birth. These are really powerful expectations, and they are doomed to fail, which is why expectations is such an important topic that runs through my book. So the goal of the book is really to explore how the aims and the struggles of feminism shaped the expectations of subsequent generations of girls and women, and how these expectations, these dreams and these hopes and these plans have in turn shaped and occasionally misshaped the lived experiences of millions of American women. So we inherited a set of expectations that at the moment are actually dooming us to failure. So what the book does is that each chapter follows a different phase in the trajectory of a woman's life. So I look in turn at girls, how we raise girls. I look at bodies and body image. I look at sex, which was a really hard chapter to write, marriage, babies, jobs, domestic relations, and aging. Because we have limited time, I'm just going to talk briefly today about 3 of these chapters or 3 of these life phases. I want to talk about jobs, which is the one that gets most of the media attention, but I think is actually only a small piece of the overall puzzle. I want to talk about domestic relations, the searing issue of who makes the dental appointments. And I want to talk about beauty, which is a topic that I didn't think would play a big role in the book, but winds up actually being very important and cutting across nearly all of the chapters in the book. Okay, major caveat before I get started. This is an elitist book. It's not because I want to write an elitist book, it's because a large part of the book has become my personal experience. It's situated at places like Harvard College, Harvard Business School, Barnard College, which by their very nature are elite, if not elitist, at least elite institutions. So I am not talking about the very, very real problems, the worst problems that are faced by poor women in Bangladesh, poor women in this country. That is another whole series of books Maybe I'll write that book next. But this book is really about the people in this room. It's the people who have lives of great privilege to begin with, but nevertheless still somehow seem to make themselves miserable. It's not that depressing, actually. All right. So let me start by talking about women in the workplace. And as I said a moment ago, this is really the most obvious arena in which the, quote, women's problem remains. So let me just cut to the chase. Even though women have stormed into the workforce in ways and numbers that would have baffled their grandmothers, our ascent into positions of power has been much slower and less complete than nearly any red-blooded feminist would have imagined 50 years ago. Let me start with the good news. Girls today in the United States are trouncing boys in high school and college, and even extending into graduate school. If you just look at leadership positions in high schools, they are being overwhelmingly held by girls. Girls are the valedictorians, girls are the yearbook editor, girls are winning the community service awards in much greater numbers than boys. Girls are outscoring boys on the verbal portions of the SAT, and they're rapidly catching up in math. Girls are outdoing boys in college admissions, to the point where boys are now considered affirmative action cases in many elite colleges. I presented this as very good news to my son last year. I said, fabulous, honey, you're a rich kid from the Upper West Side and you're affirmative action. But joking aside, in 2009, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission actually began investigating possible discrimination against women because colleges are bending over backwards to try to maintain a roughly equal gender balance in their incoming classes. Even with this gender balancing, which is very clear, it's not going on at Barnard, we only take women, but at other colleges, even with this gender balancing, male enrollment now across the country is only 43% of all college students, down from 60% in 1969. So women are becoming a majority of our highly educated population. In 2008-2009, women topped men for the first time in the winning of doctoral degrees, including 70% of PhDs in the health fields, which is a huge number. You wouldn't imagine that a few years ago. Women constitute 47% of law school students and 35% of business school, still lower. At HBS, thank you, Young Me, for giving me all the data, the percentage of women in the first-year class has risen from about 28% when I started to 40% today, which is a huge shift because at 28% you're a minority, at 40% you're starting to approach parity in the classroom. Women are also increasingly holding some of the highest profile positions in the country. 3 Supreme Court justices, 3 presidential and vice presidential candidates over the past few years, 50% of the Ivy League presidents. So lots of numbers at the tippy top of the pyramid. The bad news, though, is that the pipeline of all of these incredibly high-achieving girls, these women going to college, these women going to grad school, the pipeline drops out before you reach the top of pretty much any position or any industry in this country. And it's kind of bizarre how the numbers work, because pretty much across industry sectors, women are stuck somewhere between 10 and 18% of the top of the pyramid. It's very bizarre, the consistency in these numbers. So you've probably seen most of these, but 15% of Fortune 100 executive committees, 16% of equity partners at law firms, given that 47% of law school students are female and have been for 20 years now. 10% of aerospace engineers, 7% of Hollywood directors. We have a film festival at Barnard to honor women who work behind the camera, and the 7% of directors is lower than aerospace engineers, which is just mind-boggling. 17% of the Senate, 16% of the House, all stuck in this kind of purgatory around 16%. And the reason I find that number so interesting is it does reflect to me kind of that thing I've faced all my life. Gee, we really need a woman. So I get one, maybe two, and then it's like done. We're not getting anywhere close to critical mass at the top of the pyramid. The even worse news is that 30 years ago, you could have blamed this problem on the pipeline, saying that, well, and people still say this, but it's just statistically wrong. The reason we're not getting more women into, let's say, equity positions at law firms is because there's not enough of them coming through the ranks. Well, they've been coming through the ranks since my generation. And we are dropping out. So something is happening in the pipeline. It's not the pipeline anymore. In other words, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we could point to obvious kinks in the pipeline, to the fact that women were not admitted to the most prestigious Ivy League colleges, that they couldn't go to Harvard Business School, that they couldn't go to the clubs, the all-male dining clubs that are still sort of breeding grounds for success, that they couldn't play high school and collegiate sports, which turn out, I think, to be a very interesting piece of this puzzle, because competitive sports also turn out to be a training ground and a breeding ground for leadership. That they could actively not be hired by corporations that were worried that they might, heaven forbid, get pregnant, and that they couldn't manage their own reproductive lives in a way to try and line up their career goals with their family goals. All of those obstacles are now gone, but we still see this situation across industry sectors. Why? I will throw out 4 hypotheses. I will not give you my preferred one at the moment, but I will throw them out there for subsequent case method discussion. The first is what I would call embedded discrimination. And this is really, really subtle, but I see it all the time. That people are sitting around a boardroom or a management committee meeting or what have you, and they have to figure out who to make partner, who to promote, who to give a big award to. They tend to just move towards people other than women. They just are not in the consciousness unless somebody says, gee, we really need a woman. And then if you happen to be that one woman, you're good. But oftentimes, also, once one woman has been chosen, then it's like they've done the woman thing and then you can move on. And it'll be interesting now, we have a number of Ivy League presidencies open, whether places that had their first woman now go back, or whether there's some sense, and UPenn did do this, that you can actually have 2 women in a row. But many times, and I really do see this all the time, there's a sense that once you have one woman, you're kind of off the hook for getting any more. A second piece, and again, I see this all the time, and I think it's really interesting, and people should be doing more work on this. There is an inclination for replication. We all think that we're really good. And therefore, that the people who are most like us are liable to be really good as well. And I didn't quite realize this until I got to Barnard, because what I realized, Barnard replicates as much as HBS does. So if HBS is run by middle-aged white guys, they will tend to see younger white guys as the most likely leaders. Barnard is run by middle-aged Jewish ladies. So we're always looking for the next generation of young Jewish ladies. But we replicate. And my husband caught me doing exactly the same thing recently. I was describing who I described as one of my best faculty members, and I was just, waxing eloquent about her many talents. My husband said, "You do realize you were describing yourself, that she's young, she's high energy, she has brown hair." I had sort of fallen for someone who was very much like me, and I think we all do that. And I think it's particularly tends to happen when people reach middle age, and they're realizing that either they don't have children, or that their own children, wonderful though they are, in fact, aren't mini-me's. They're not doing what their parents did. And I think the parents sort of gravitate towards younger versions of themselves. And they are the ones who they tend to promote and take through the ranks. And it's not an evil thing at all, but I think it's one of these very powerful patterns by which organizations replicate themselves. And as a result of which, it makes it very hard to get true diversity. The third piece I want to throw out there is difference in operational styles. This is very controversial. My feminist friends don't like when I say this, but I do think that women, on average and in the aggregate, do tend to manage differently than men. Women tend to be less competitive in terms of putting themselves forward. They tend to be less loud in terms of touting their own successes. They tend to favor consensus. Again, none of which are good or bad. They're just different. So if you're, and again, I see this at Barnard. Barnard is a place that runs on love. And we won't do anything until we have consensus. So if you introduce a man or a woman who is used to moving faster, the organization will kind of push that person to the sidelines because they're moving too fast. Flip that and you get HBS. They're just, and again, I honestly don't think it's better or worse, but it's different. And which means if you put a woman in an all-male environment, she is going to have a tougher time playing by the rules unless she really conforms or adapts to a very different mindset. One of the first people I hired at Barnard was a very aggressive, he's a very male guy. And he had a really tough time fitting in, and people would complain that he was being sexist and aggressive. And I said, no, he's actually just being kind of male. But because the organization wasn't used to that, it took a while. So, and I think these are things, they're very hard to say, but I think we need to say them. And I think Robin's work has touched on some elements of this, although I won't make her take credit for my argument. And then the fourth thing I want to put out there is even more controversial, but I just think it has to be said. As some of you may know, I wrote my last book on reproductive medicine. So I'm actually an expert in high-tech reproduction. And let me assure you, women have babies. Men don't. That is not going to change. And this is a very, very important aspect of kind of everything related to gender differences. Because if you look at the data, women fall out of the pipeline when they have children, and men don't. And we have both societally and even legally, the way we've structured things like family leaves. Family leaves, as you may know, are structured as sick leaves. They are to take care of a medical condition known as pregnancy. But having a child is not just a medical condition. It is an extended, multi-year commitment. And at some level, the length of your maternity leave really doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is everything subsequent to that. And I think unless we wrestle with this reality, we're never actually going to get at the core of the gender differences we're seeing in the workplace. So let me just leave those out there and turn to the next topic, which is women at home. And I think it's useful here to begin with Betty Friedan's Feminist Mystique, which is one of the key texts of the feminist movement. And it's certainly the text that, for better or worse, shaped popular perceptions and expectations of what feminism would or should bring. It's a great book. At least it's a great first 3 or 4 chapters. I would actually urge you to, it gets a little long, but it's really, it does, but it's brilliant. And it's really, really interesting and worth rereading or reading if you, like me, actually never did read it going through college and grad school. And what Friedan does that I think has sort of gotten lost in the sands of time is that the book is really about, or largely about, urging women to get out of the kitchen, to throw off the duties of housekeeping, to stop waxing their floors, to stop polishing everything in their house. Or as she says, the first step is to see housework for what it is, not a career, but something that must be done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Friedan blames a lot of women's focus on housework on Madison Avenue, which not sure I agree with, but it's an interesting argument that she's saying women started doing a lot more housework because companies like P&G were sort of pushing them in that direction. But the big brunt of her argument was to get out of the house and do something else. And, as I just mentioned, to a large extent, this has happened. I won't drag you through the numbers. You can see them. We listened to part of it. We got out of the house. We got into the workplace. But we never stopped doing the housework. And one of the great books, The Second Shift. Now, these data are a bit old. This is from Arlie Hochschild's work of some years ago. But if you see the difference here, At the time she did this, and this was for couples in which both partners worked, women were doing 3 hours a day of housework, men 17 minutes. Women were averaging 50 minutes a day with their children, men 12. Each week, on average, women were working 15 hours more than men. And if you just start multiplying this out, it kills you, right? It just means that a woman will never really be able to compete with a man in the workplace because she's doing essentially a second job. And that's the title of Hochschild's book, The Second Shift. Now, this was just as these sort of social patterns were starting to change. But researchers have redone the data, and the good news is that they are shifting them. They are shifting. Men are doing considerably more work at home, and particularly childcare, than they were 20 years ago. But if you see what's happening to women, the second shift has not gone away. So women are working in record numbers across the paid workforce, and yet they're still doing really a full-time job at home. 40 hours a week. Now, again, the good news, it's gone down from 49, which is a significant drop. But this is a full-time job on top of a full-time job. And if you think about, we were talking earlier about high-pressure jobs that are 60, 80 hours a week. You can't do that. You can't do an 80-hour-a-week job and a 40-hour-a-week housework. You just physically can't do it. And where women are making it up, and the numbers I think don't quite convey the misery here, is free time just disappears, sleep disappears. And you wind up with really an unsustainable situation. So again, we have to ask why. We've known these facts for a long time. Why are women sort of unable to get out of the kitchen and perhaps drag men in? And again, I'll sort of throw out 5 possibilities. The first possibility is that men are bad. I happen to not think that's true. But if you just sort of read through the stuff out there, it still has a lot of element of that. That men just aren't willing to do the work. I really don't think it's true, but the data would give you some reason to suspect that hypothesis could be true. A second one, and Youngmi mentioned my sort of diss of my poor husband in my article, but you can refer to this as the missing dental appointment gene. That men from birth or through the media or through peer pressure or through work pressure just don't feel that they can or should make the dental appointment, go to the ballet rehearsal, take time off to go to the school visit. And what happens is that women do that work, and men, even though they may want to do it, somehow lives are arranged that it doesn't happen. And most of you in the room are too young to have entered this stage of your lives, but ask folks a little bit older, just in kind of any household, who does the doctor's appointment, the teacher's visits, the sock shopping, and you'll start to see pretty disparate divisions of labor, shifting, but still pretty disparate. Related to that, though, and I think this is, again, a really important point that doesn't get enough research, it's not clear to me that organizations make it easy for men to take time to go to the flute practice and the doctor's appointment. And in some cases, I think organizations are actually more forgiving of women doing that than men doing that. So it's okay for the mom to go to the teacher's appointment, but not for the dad. And you start replicating that out, and you get what, in my field of political science, we would have called path dependency. If it's somewhat easier for the woman to take the time off, she winds up doing it constantly. And the man never does it. And then, by the end of the day, one person knows where the dentist is and the other person doesn't. And those patterns just get deeply embedded. The final explanation I want to throw out there goes back to this notion of expectations. And I must confess, I think this is the most important one. So I'm now going to show you a couple of fairly random magazine photos chosen by my research assistant. I just asked her to find me pictures of a couple of things. Okay, so this is from a recent magazine of do-it-yourself Halloween costumes. So this is from Good Housekeeping or Martha Stewart Living. This is how you're supposed to dress your kid for Halloween. Now, notice what these children are wearing. These are not bought from any CVS. These are not thrown together from aluminum foil in the kitchen. These are handmade, hand-sewn, hand-curled Halloween costumes that took somebody hours and hours of time to put together. I know young me does these all the time. All right? So this you'll see, this is just all our sort of autumn theme here. Magic holiday cupcakes. Okay? When I had a Halloween party, my mother bought, store-bought cookies, because that's what you did. And now, again, even in magazines like Simple, these are the cupcakes. These are not simple cupcakes to make. You are dyeing things, you are gluing things, you are cutting things. This, again, is hours and hours of work. And it's not presented as what you might want to do for that once-in-a-lifetime wedding of your child. This is what you're supposed to be doing on like a Tuesday night before bake sale. And when you're done with that, you can make a bird feeder. Okay? These are not extreme examples. And you'll get a different palette if you do this in December when it's the Christmas crafts, and a different palette in February when it's the Valentine's Day crafts. And again, most of you in this room are too young to have gone through this yet, but this is what life as a sort of average American mom is like. And it's not just the crazy people who are doing this stuff. This is what the expectation is, that you're cutting pumpkins in half to keep the birds happy. This, in my humble opinion, this is what's killing American women, or at least just driving them nuts. Because you now somehow feel, if you're not feeding the birds at this level, you have failed as a human being. And there was a nasty book that came out recently by Martha Stewart's daughter, Complicated Relationship, in which she said, her mother has never actually made anything in her life. Which, of course, she can't, because she's running a multi-million-dollar media empire. But nevertheless is creating a perception that this is, in fact, what sort of just gets you over the bar in terms of being a moderately successful woman. So the irony in all this is, if you go back to where I started with Betty Friedan, is that just at the moment that American women have moved into the workplace, rather than lowering the expectations of what women should be doing on the home front, which is exactly what Friedan was talking about, we've actually ratcheted them up. And I don't know of a way to give data on this, but I think if you just look at sort of the media, the societal, the expectations that are out there in the media and in the ether, we've upped the expectations of what it means to be a decent wife or mother. And again, the sort of flippant example I oftentimes throw out there is that if you watch Mad Men, a good mother just meant being vaguely aware that your children were alive while you were sipping martinis. Now we drive them everywhere. I can't tell you how many people ask me, how do you have time to do your kids' homework? Answer, I don't. It's their homework. But there is an expectation that parents, and particularly mothers, are deeply involved in their kids' lives in a way that only adds to these hours of expectations. And so what happens as a result is that women have seen their expectations ratcheted up, and then they blame themselves when they fall short. They also tend to think, and this also came up in our conversation earlier, or want at least to be able to manage their households and their lives in very neat and discreet packages. I don't think this was true for women even when their lives were relegated to being full-time homemakers, and I certainly don't think it's true for women who are trying to juggle family, careers, children, relationships, pumpkin carving, and some degree of sanity. Which brings me to my third theme. Beauty, anorexia, and control. And this is a theme that I didn't think would be in the book, and wound up, in fact, being quite a powerful theme. Because one of the other things, we won't have to read this whole thing, but one of the other things that feminism was supposed to be about was moving away from valuing women based on their bodies. And this is a quote from Andrew Dworkin, who was probably one of the most radical feminists, but nevertheless put out this very powerful argument that we as a society had to stop treating women just on the basis of their bodies as sexual entities or their beauty. A very powerful sentiment. And here's where we are today. I'm not sure we've gotten anywhere close to where Dworkin was pushing us. And in fact, I think we can argue that we've actually gone the other way, just as we have with homework. These are sort of, average models. They'll look like, model in any magazine you pick. This is kind of interesting. These are pop stars, mostly Britney Spears and Miley Cyrus. Once upon a time, women became famous for singing because they could sing. They were people like Janis Joplin and Carole King, who really were famous for the songs they put together, the words, their voices. I'm not sure that singing talent is really what we're now valuing in pop stars. And it's interesting, if you look even at probably the two biggest female pop stars right now, Adele and Lady Gaga, look at the makeovers they have undergone in very different ways since becoming pop stars. You're not allowed to be a pop star unless you're gorgeous, in addition to whatever else you have. What also has happened, which I find quite frightening, is that our standards for beauty not only apply when you're 22, when, sorry, it's relatively easy to be beautiful. This is Toddlers and Tiaras. You're supposed to look 22 when you're 4. And you're supposed to look 22 when you're 62. Okay, this is a quote-unquote older woman model. It's hard to see her as being very old, other than the very attractive sort of floof of white hair that she has there. But the expectation is that women are going to look 22 into their 70s. And it's not just in sort of the popular media. These may not have been the best examples to choose. But there's a certain type that applies across the political spectrum, across the business spectrum. So these were just from the Forbes or Fortune Most Powerful Women. And these were chosen relatively at random. But if you look here, they kind of all look the same. Same haircut, same suit. That would apply for men as well. No degree of ethnicity. No wrinkles, no fat. So we have upped the ante in terms of what it takes to be a successful woman to a fairly narrow range. And particularly a range that for most women, once they're no longer 22, actually takes a lot of time to accomplish, which adds to the bizarre burden of hours that most women are spending merely to get to work in the morning. This was a quote that made me just nuts. So Christine Lagarde gets named the new head of the IMF. She's replacing a guy who's just been accused of rape. And the Times, this is not like People magazine, this is the New York Times on the front page, feels it's appropriate to comment on her Hermes Saks and her Christian Louboutin heels. This is still fair game. And I find that just sort of remarkable, given, again, where we thought we might have come in these 50 years. So it's very hard for me to argue that things have gotten any better on the sort of physical front for women. Instead, the pressure on, it's not just American women, you see this around the world, the pressure on women to look beautiful begins earlier and it ends later. It is being aided and enabled and driven by the exploding market for plastic surgery. 12 million Americans undergo cosmetic surgery every year, a number that's up by over 500% since 1997, and the ever-present focus on weight and diet, which hasn't changed that much over the past years. If you look at women on TV, it's very hard to believe that any woman ever looks older than 27. And these are probably two of the most powerful women on TV. But they do not look like the men on TV in their age range. Meanwhile, the real 27-year-olds and the real 15-year-olds and the real 22-year-olds are starving themselves in ever-increasing numbers. In the United States alone, 10 million women and girls struggle with anorexia every year. 95% of anorexia victims are between 12 and 25, and 10% of them die. It's very hard to get data on anorexia because you ultimately don't die of anorexia, you die of something else caused by anorexia. But these numbers are huge, and they're almost all girls. It's a big problem at Barnard, because we have an all-female population, and I'm sure it's a big problem among all female populations. We just probably see it more. Anorexia is a very complicated phenomenon. There's all kinds of hypotheses about what causes it. People blame the media. People blame the fashion industry. Certainly the modeling industry has to bear some of the blame for this. But I want to just throw out one other hypothesis, and this is the thread that I see running throughout the book. I think anorexia is about control. It's about girls maniacally counting calories or counting miles on a treadmill because ultimately they can control that part of their lives. If you eat 3 carrots and a yogurt a day, you are going to lose weight. If you run 20 miles a week on a treadmill, you're going to get thinner thighs. You can control that aspect of your life. And I think what we're seeing is that this underlying obsession with control is what drives anorexia, or at least a number of the cases of anorexia. But it's the same obsession with control that drives us to the stupid bird feeder and the cupcakes and the needing to feel that you have to have a perfect household and perfect kids. I think this is part and parcel of the same set of grossly unrealistic expectations that particularly wealthy, successful, ambitious women in this country are laboring under. We are all bedeviled by the expectation that we can look good and stay thin, that we can time our babies to correspond with our careers, that we can make those babies perfect, that we can then ensure that those perfect babies become perfect children who will get perfect grades and will get into a perfect college. We're going to make them perfect costumes and perfect cupcakes and create the perfect bake sales at every step along the way. And it's very easy to laugh at this stuff because it's silly, particularly the cupcakes and the bird feeders. But the more I've looked at this topic and the more women I speak to, I've become increasingly convinced that it's actually this pursuit of perfection that is deeply damaging to women. And it may in subtle ways be what's keeping them from the highest realms of power. Because you're not going to go for that job if you don't think you can be perfect at it. You're not going to go for that job if you think it will mean becoming less perfect at some other part of your life, which it will have to, because you're going to have to make trade-offs to have those tippy-top jobs. And I certainly think that it's this pursuit of perfection that is making women less happy. And there was a fascinating study that came out in 2009 by 2 economists at Princeton, and they found that American women, regardless of race, income, and employment status, are statistically less happy today than they were in the 1970s. So we've kind of gotten what we said we wanted, and we're distinctly less happy as a result. So let me just conclude with the irony that I'm increasingly seeing as a central theme of this book. Feminism was supposed to be about granting women power and equality, and then about harnessing that power for positive change. Or to quote Dworkin again, it was, quote, a political action where revolution is the goal, part of a planetary movement to restructure community forms and human consciousness so that people have power over their own lives, participate fully in community, live in dignity and freedom. It was a social movement. Instead, though, new generations of women, including, and I think beginning with my own, have turned away from feminism's external and social goals, and we've instead turned in on our own lives, focusing not, for instance, on better public schools for our neighborhood, but on pushing our own kids' SAT scores. Not on social equity writ large, but on the professional advancement of our own sector of professionals in whatever industry we may be working in. Rather than trying to address the world, we're trying to control our own small and very personal pieces of it. These are big statements to make, and I know I'm being provocative, and there are millions of women out there doing great things and working to change the world. But in general, I think that much of the choice, and I use that word carefully and quotation marks, that much of the choice that feminism fought for and won has, ironically, been multiplied and magnified to the point where women today often find themselves paralyzed by the options they apparently have. and by the expectation that they can not only entertain them all, but that indeed they can excel at them all. And I think that's really the key point. Because young women can do anything, they think that they have to do everything. I saw that at my students here, I see it in my students at Barnard, and it scares me. Because I'm seeing a generation of women who believe that they can manage their entire lives in these neat and discrete packages, shaping and controlling each piece at the appropriate time so that they can have uncommitted sex before marriage and then true romance suddenly ever after. That they can make partner or tenure or director in just the right time to find the right guy, unfreeze the eggs, and start a family. It doesn't work that neatly. It just doesn't. Life is messy and sloppy. Now, I think there is much that we can do as a society to address the women's problem. And I'm sure that when Anne Marie Slaughter is here on Thursday, she'll address some of these issues as well. We do need better daycare. We need better maternity care. We need more flex time. We need more job sharing. But ultimately, we also have to convince women themselves that feminism or women's leadership or whatever you want to call it is a social movement. It's not a 12-step program towards personal perfection. When I began this book, it was called Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist. I moved away from the title because the publishers didn't like it, but I'm becoming increasingly convinced that it's the right title, even though I won't use it, because I started the book as someone who was sort of suspicious of feminism. And I find myself coming around completely full circle in saying what I think we lost in feminism, we sort of generationally, was in fact the most important part. And that was that this is supposed to be a social movement. And it's supposed to be about working together. We've lost that communal piece because we're all focusing so much on our own individual struggles and our own individual paths towards advancement. So feminism, to some extent, got us into this mess because it is what raised women's expectations to such a high level, or at least began that push. But I also think by returning to feminism, it can show us the way out, because it can show us the way to go back to the more communal, more political, more societal parts of the message. So let me stop there. I don't know if I've left any time for questions, but you guys can tell me. We do a couple? We'll do just a couple of questions, and thank you. Questions? Yes?
I'm just wondering what you think of quota systems. So for example, in one class we talked about how in Norway they use quotas for women to get board seats. I'm just wondering how you think about it, either on boardrooms or in political circles.
This is probably nothing new to you. The problem, the good news about quotas is that they work. The bad news is that every woman who comes in as a result of the quota presumes she's there because of the quota. So I think it really undermines the sort of the confidence of women involved. I also think that they work better in countries that are more accustomed to those kinds of systems. So I think in Scandinavia they are working quite well, but it's also a much more communal, communitarian environment. The United States has big problems with quotas. I don't think they would work in this country. Yeah?
On the topic of Scandinavia, I'm not sure if you saw the recent study coming out from Norway, that couples that are more likely to share the workload, domestic workload at home 50-50 are actually more likely to get divorced. I don't understand myself how realistic it is or like what the evidence of that is, what you're getting thoughts.
Yeah, just to repeat, there's a study that came out very recently from Norway showing that couples where they shared the housework more evenly were more likely to divorce. It hit the blogosphere instantly. I can't get the study. There's some speculation that actually was not a real study. No, nobody can find the guy who ostensibly wrote it. So stay tuned. There was another study that was at least verified that couples where the men did more housework had better sex lives. So take that one as at least a half-year study. Yeah.
What do you suggest that we as individuals and also as a community do to start this social movement that you're talking
Yeah, I'm not so sure I'd even, at least personally, I'm not sure I want to start a social movement, but at least start, and we spoke about it with some of you earlier, stop beating up on other women. You know, women really have a tendency to knock down any other woman, not only just in a position of power, but, you know, gee, so-and-so didn't, you know, she bought the cookies for the bake sale. You know, we need to help each other more, and I think anything we can do in small groups to, you know, again, most of you are too young, but, you know, I have a kid, you have a kid, why don't we share a nanny? Or why don't we do backup daycare for each other? Carpooling has disappeared. You know, just a lot of the old social structures. I think we need to bring those back. And we do need to stop beating each other up, and we need to bring men into the dialogue. You know, I'm really glad that there are guys in this room. I think one of the mistakes that earlier feminism made was really seeing men as the enemy, and that may have been what they had to do in the 60s and 70s. I don't think we're there anymore. And someone was mentioning earlier that men often don't have the language to deal with this stuff. And so I think the more you can do to just sort of educate your classmates, your workmates, your friends, you know, this is what it's like for a woman to go back to work after she's just had a baby. You know, this is what she needs. She doesn't need you to send her fancy baby clothes. She needs you to let her go home Friday afternoons. I think that education is really critical. Yeah.
So I think that several years ago, or a few years ago, Larry Summers made a comment that was a bit controversial about inherent differences between men and women and why this would lead women not to perform as well in sciences. So it's very striking to hear your comments about the biology point. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the difference between, say, what you're saying and what Summers is saying, or how you reacted to what Summers said.
Well, just to be totally blunt, there are things that I can say that Larry Summers can't say. And he probably should have realized that he couldn't say that, for better or worse. But I think what you know, that was obviously a complicated story with many levels. But I think what Summers was talking about in the broader context of what he said is that there are studies out there that are serious studies that talk about, again, in the aggregate, differences in behavior patterns. And I think those are important to realize. We have to be very careful not to go to so far, and this is what Larry was heard to have said, that, you know, women can't do science. You know, things like that are dangerous, but to say that women might manage differently in a boardroom, women may run an organization differently, I think we need to examine those. And, you know, we need to not just tell stories, we actually need to do the real research. And you know, one of our male faculty members here, Boris Groisberg, whom some of you should know, wrote a fascinating study some years ago that looked at differences in men and women investment bankers. And he didn't set out to look for gender differences. He was looking at which people become stars when they move from one bank to another. And what he found was that women are much more likely to become stars when they move, or to stay stars. Whereas men's star power was more connected to an internal network. Women built external networks. That's the kind of research I think we need to do. Again, not so we come out saying this is a better model, but if you know, for example, that on the aggregate, women are going to do a better job of building external networks, and that's something that firms need, how do you actually evaluate people, both women and men, so that that's part of the assessment? So then you're valuing them for different sets of skills.
So one of the fears that I have is that I think it's easy now, when all of your peers are sort of doing the same thing as you, to think that you can continue to have a job and have a family and everything. But then my fear is that when I get to a certain point, a lot of my friends will stop working, and I will think that I'm not doing a good job by continuing to work.
And they will think that they're doing a bad job by not working. That's exactly what will happen.
So I'm curious if you ever faced that sort of crisis of confidence and feeling like you were not doing a good job by continuing to work. If so, how you cope with it, or why you continue to work?
Yes, constantly is the short answer. But I think I'll just answer it partly with a brief anecdote. I was in Hong Kong a year ago, and I met with the Hong Kong Women's Financial, or Women in Finance, whatever it was. What was so interesting about that group is it was half composed of women who were working and half composed of women who weren't working. But the women who weren't working were still part of the organization. The women who were working made a point of talking about how important it was for them to have women in their kids' schools who weren't working. They were actually validating each other's decisions. And the women who weren't working were staying involved with networks, and the women who were working had networks back in their home lives. We don't do that in this country. You know, I think that's one of the things, is to make sure that our professional networks include women who aren't working or who may not be working for a little period of time. And then I think, again, we have to stop the kind of mommy wars, which occur all the time. You know, oh, you're not working. Oh, you must never see your children. I mean, we all, you know, some of it's human nature, but sort of fighting against that is really important, because what I see, you know, the point in my life is literally the women on both sides are feeling miserable. And that just makes zero sense. Yeah.
I think we're learning and hearing from you kind of like how you engage males in your career, especially like mentorships from them. We had a case discussion about a female, and one of the ladies in our class talked about how for her it was really difficult having mentors that are male, because there's this perception, oh, what is he interested in? Yet we have to recognize we're still the majority, so us getting promoted or not will likely be dependent on men.
Yep.
So how do you get a lot of like male mentors and have them help you?
So this is a great question, and it rarely gets asked, and it's a really important question. You cannot depend on only women mentors. First of all, as you say, there's not enough. And secondly, it's not fair to the women, because, you know, if there's only 2 senior women in a corporation, they can't be mentoring all the junior women. It will kill them. You're going to have male mentors. And I have to say, one of the things that I am most grateful to this place about is I had incredibly good male mentors. And they were men who took me under their wing, gave me really tough criticism. One of the things that I think men have to do a better job of is giving tough criticism to women. I think there's a sense that guys are scared to criticize women because it'll look like they're being mean. Believe me, I had lots of guys who gave me really tough criticism, and it's exactly what I needed. And to be perfectly blunt, both the male mentor and the woman mentee have to just deal with the fact that in the environment we're in, people may raise questions, and you just have to make sure there's no fact to their question. You know, there's no evidence there, but that, you know, that you go ahead, because the relationships are critical. I did once have a senior man say to me, you know, haha, I'd never take you on a business trip because my wife would not forgive me. What does that do to my career? If you can't take me on a business trip, on a consulting trip, and you're taking my male colleague, I'm not going to get promoted. We have to get past that, and that's where the burden is, I think, on both people to make it work. And it happened for me here. All of my mentors were male. Yeah, the man in the back.
So you kind of covered those 3 areas in the presentation. I just want to kind of talk about each of them. Like the first one, it seems in terms of education and positions of leadership, we're slowly making progress. Much further behind than we should be, but we're going in the right direction. The household relationship also looks like slowly improving, way far away from where it needs to be, but getting better.
Yeah.
The final piece on expectations, though, it seems like we've made radical kind of regression. And the examples you showed were in media and in fashion, like 2 places which I don't think are necessarily male-dominated industries.
Yeah.
I guess, like, what happened there, what caused it, and how do we make that go in the right direction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know. Because that really is the sneaky one, and it feels like it's the silly one, it's the frivolous one. But I think, especially now hanging out with younger women as I do, I think that's a lot of what's killing them. It is this expectation that, you know, they have to look hot at the same time they're doing really well in a math class, and that's hard. And I don't know how we fight against it. There's been some interesting first steps, but they all seem to sort of happen and then fizzle out. There was a group of high school girls recently who protested for one of the magazines. I forget what it was, Glamour, maybe? One of the young women's magazines, to petition them to actually put real girls in the magazine, you know, who had sort of normal bodies. And the magazine did it for 1 issue. We'll have to see if it keeps going. And again, it's very easy to just sort of blame the media in the abstract, but it's also sort of pushing back on a day-to-day basis against these stereotypes, which is really, really hard.
Just a follow-up. I guess, why didn't Oprah and Angela Merkel make the kind of like the big leaders or role models?
Oh, good question. Probably just because they weren't in that issue. But Angela Merkel is amazing. I think Angela Merkel is, and I don't know that she's a big enough popular presence in this country to have sort of entered the, sort of the media ether. But she is a really, really interesting female leader who's, sort of single-handedly keeping the European Union together right now, and doing so in a way that I really think will set a standard, or at least another model for women's leadership. And Oprah is just an entity unto herself. Let me end there. Thank you so much.